So hi everyone, this is Shannon. Welcome back. Eve Intersected. We're on our path towards discussing truth and reconciliation and the calls to action. So our episode today is featuring Marc St. Pierre from Ottawa Sport and Entertainment Group. I will affectionately call it OSEG throughout the episode, but that's what I'm referring to when I say that. Welcome, Marc. Thank you for giving us our time. I'd love to just turn it to you to give us a bit of a bio and your background, and welcome.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to chat a bit about OSEG and I think the sports landscape as a whole in Canada with you as well on this podcast. So my background is I'm a manager of community relations for OSEG. So Ottawa Sport and Entertainment Group, we manage the site here at TD Place on the unceded territory of Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation here in Ottawa. So just as part of that, our team manages the site here. We also own and operate the Ottawa 67s, which is a team in the OHL, and the Ottawa Red Blacks is a team in the CFL, so the Canadian Football League. And so each of those leagues will play a bit in a role of what I talked about today. So I work very closely with the athletes on that side. A lot of the work I do is managing what our athletes are doing outside of their day-to-day on the football field or on the ice. And I also work closely with our tenant teams this year as well. So we have a number of professional tenant teams that work out of our facility and operate our facility including women's hockey teams, women's soccer teams, other soccer teams and basketball teams as well in the Canadian leagues. So we're fortunate to see a pretty broad scope of things within our space here. I went to Western University for my undergrad. I also just finished my MBA at University of Ottawa as well. And so I have a bit of background in sports and business and work kind of cross-sectionally within our marketing team, but also our foundation and community relations team. So I get a fortunate look of different areas of the organization and get very involved in a lot of the truth and reconciliation work we do here at OSEG.
Amazing. And I appreciate the education background too. We talked a little bit about, we did a previous episode where we were just talking through some of the calls to action and truth and reconciliation and recognizing that sport doesn't function in a silo. And so sport, education, health, all part of the calls to action and certainly influences how we engage with them. But thank you again for being with us. And I'm going to jump right into the first question, sort of thinking about how our sport organizations can and should be engaging with the calls to action. One, recognizing what they are, and we'll put a link in the episode description in terms of just really familiarizing ourselves with the calls. But what does OSEG do currently to address the calls to action from the TRC?
For sure. It's a great question. I think the calls to action is a great starting point for a lot of the work we do and how we engage with Indigenous communities. It's a good starting point in terms of talking about what our scope could be and what our scale could be. I'll be honest, in terms of the truth and reconciliation calls to action, I wouldn't say it's not within the scope, but we don't necessarily look at that in everything we do. We do keep it pretty broad and keep an open mind in terms of what we're looking at. So I think there's a list of 4 to 5 different calls to action that are specific to sports within there. The one that I think really falls within a lot of the work we do is number 90, which is around the federal government to ensure national policies and programs and initiatives are inclusive of Aboriginal peoples, but not limited to certain aspects of it. That's obviously calling on the federal government, but as stewards within the sports space, we kind of fall within a lot of the work that happens in federal grants and everything that come through as well from that space. So that's a big one. I know our foundation has been involved in over the years of trying to find a gap to fill in some of the barriers that exist for Indigenous people within Canada and how they access sport, and especially the access to some of the more traditional sports that Indigenous people participate in that don't always get reflected within our traditional system now in Canada. So that's something that our team, so from my side of the business, I guess, aspect of it, and our Red Blacks and 67s, we try to work in how do we incorporate Indigenous voices into what we're doing for the day-to-day, for game days, for leading into Truth and Reconciliation. So obviously September coming up very, very soon, just before the next month coming up here from us. So I think the big part of that is why we're ensuring that the community's voices are being heard, but also that we're acting in accordance with what they want. So if we're doing like a minor football engagement with the Indigenous community, that they're their voices are helping plan it. They're also helping engage with the youth that are participating in it. So we do stuff like that on the Red Black side. And then on the hockey side, we actually have one of our players who's from the Indigenous community, who's from Manitoulin Island. His dad is actually very involved in Indigenous tourism in Ontario as well. So having them as people who are involved in the day-to-day playing process. I just had a chat with his dad the other day, actually, about what we're doing in September and how his family could get involved in that. And then from the foundation side, they more obviously on the sport development angle of it, but they're looking at running programming for Indigenous youth. One of our EDI grants actually just went to Waboso, which is a local charity here in the city. And so they're running a softball program for some of the girls and women in their space on the Indigenous side. And so our foundation gets involved in that. They're also helping run a hockey clinic in the next few weeks for a local Indigenous community, especially we're fairly close to a couple of different communities, both obviously on the Algonquin territory, but also the Mohawk Nation, which is down near Akwesasne. So we do engage with a few different communities, and they have their own traditional sport, what they bring to the table in terms of what they like to see in sport as well, and how they get their community active. So I guess that's kind of a roundabout way of saying it's really about the sport development side, but also ensuring that their voices are heard. I believe it's number 87 is the other call to action that falls into that, of how we're telling the Indigenous story through what we're doing, and the Sports Hall of Fames and the day-to-day of our stories. And that's, I think, the big thing. We went through a bit of a transformation process this year, or in, I guess, 24 to 25 with having an Indigenous hockey player, is how do we tell the story and be authentic to that story and not let's say take advantage, but not use it as a token in a way, and make sure that he feels comfortable. He was also coming in as a 16-year-old, so he's fairly young in terms of his own story. And so our team was very cognizant of that. They actually ended up winning the social storytelling award for the OHL this year. And some of that came from some of that lens of they were very authentic in how they told his story of being from an Indigenous community. So it's a bit of a mix. Like it's always, this whole space is very say fluid, but it's flexible. You're trying to find the nuance to it. But I think those two calls to action, 87 and 90, are the two big ones we focus on.
Yeah, well, lots going on through that. And I was taking notes, and just one of the things I want to follow up with is you mentioned this notion of connecting with Indigenous communities. And then you have the explicit link to a player, but before the player who identifies as Indigenous, how do you make those connections? If we're speaking to an audience who may be trying to answer the calls themselves, how do you start making those links to community in authentic ways within OSEG?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the one example maybe I'll use, which I think is a really good example of this, is especially we've done a Indigenous football clinic each of the last couple of years with a gentleman named Ben Miracle, who is the quarterback of the Ottawa GGs for a number of years. And so he's actually from he's from the Mohawk Nation, but he has family in Akwesasne, which is where one of the Indigenous communities that we work with fairly closely. And the GG is obviously involved in that from the Ottawa side as well. And so I think what I suggest to people is that keep your eyes and ears open when you're going through your day-to-day. Obviously, somebody that works in community relations, I see a pretty broad scale of our community. I see charities. I see hundreds of charities events over the years. I see people walking into stadium, fans, thousands of them every year. And I always am very cognizant of the stories that are walking into our stadium or the people we're engaging with, because a lot of the time they are the ones that could be a connector for you. And so Ben's a great example of that, as somebody I'd already worked with the Argos, actually. So the Argos, the Toronto Argonauts in Toronto, the CFL team, they already had a clinic that they ran. And so he came to us through the GGs, but I knew him indirectly from the work he had done with the GGs as well. So there's some of those natural connections that are there already. I think we just are, I don't say we're siloed ourselves, but sometimes we silo ourselves in our day-to-day and we don't think about the stories that each person's bringing to the table. And that's where I think a lot of those natural connections has come from. As even, for example, I'll use this example because it's relevant to my world right now. We had, say 2022, we did a Truth and Reconciliation focused game for the Red Blacks. It was the first time we had done one. The CFL had come down and asked us to do one as part of a across the league mandate. And we had a connection through one of our owners who works on the development side and the developer side, but he knew a local lawyer who was also connected to the Algonquin Nation. And so just like that connection, it's never directly through the organizations themselves. It's often through a person who knows somebody else that's connected in that way. And I think that's where a lot of these relationships come from. And knowing some of the ways the Indigenous community works, that's a lot of how they operate as well. They're very consensus based. They're really relationship focused. And so I think a lot of where the authentic partnerships come from is from that authentic connection and those local relationships you can make.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say the same thing about this idea of connection. Like you said that word quite a few times. And I think it's so important when we think of authentic ways of connecting to human beings. So it's a big piece of sometimes we get lost in athletes just thinking they're athletes or sports sort of sitting in this isolated world. But it's all about human beings interacting and competing and thriving, really, at the core of it. And you emphasize that a lot in your answer, which I appreciate. And you came back to call 87. I think that's a big piece, too, is when we start to tell stories, we can start to break down assumptions as well, because we may assume things about where someone is from or how they identify. And those assumptions are often inaccurate and problematically inaccurate, right? And so I hear what you are doing and some of the folks in OSEG are doing is trying to just listen and be involved and hear the stories and then start to develop those relationships, which is quite fantastic. And I do feel like that's a piece of this when we say, how do we answer the calls, is to really just think about how we engage with people and how we listen and how we embrace relationships in a different way, which is really fantastic. The other question that I had following, and we did have the structured questions, but from what you're saying, because you're saying so many things, you talked about the foundation. And so I think maybe I inaccurately assumed, we're talking about assumptions, that the foundation maybe creates their own events, but it sounds like the foundation also just gets involved or supports events. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Nope, you're exactly right. So they do a bit of both. We run our grants program through our foundation, which is an EDI grants program. We also have a majority of our funding goes towards programs that we run authentically on ourselves. But a part of it is also funding those new ones. It's barely been a couple of years now since we've done it, but we will fund programs and then sometimes take them over ourselves as well if it makes more sense for us to fund it. I'll use it. The recent example is Autism Moves, is a local autism program that was run for a number of years here in Ottawa. They didn't have the funding model to continue, but we ended up taking over a lot of the similar programming and work that they did. Right now, I know the foundation is working on how we best create an Indigenous program. I know they want to own an Indigenous program in-house as well. But I think going back to what I had said originally, a lot of the time you need to connect and let others lead, especially those from that community, before you can get fully embraced and involved in what they're doing. None of the work we ever want to do, especially on the diversity, equity, inclusion side, is us trying to take something over and own it before it's at a point where we can understand it. So I think that's a lot of the difference where the foundation's at right now. So they obviously, I've mentioned they've supported a youth softball program through Waboso, which is another Indigenous charity. It's actually the Trudeau family is one of their favorite charities in Ottawa, which is a funny connection in that way. But then we've also supported an Indigenous hockey clinic. I think the big thing to stress about their own programming and them owning programming is that Indigenous community members, and it's completely fair for them to feel this, they don't always feel like they want to give up these programs. They want to own them themselves, because I would say like Westernization and colonization has taken over a lot of the work that they do over the years and has made it in its own culture, in its own way. And I think they want to keep it as authentic as possible. And so it can be harder to maybe build that relationship where somebody has that trust. So I think that's part of it. It was like they haven't really created their own program yet, just because it hasn't felt like the right time for it. But they do have a number of their own programs, but also fund other programs as well.
Yeah. And we know building trust takes a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we live in a world where people want things immediately. So yes. That trust building is quite important in any relationship, but in these relationships in particular. So Marc, this is awesome. I'm learning a lot, and I also hear all the wonderful work that OSEG is doing, and I continue to emphasize this idea of relationship building, and really sharing stories is so important when we do this work. And Who's involved? I know, Marc, you've agreed to talk with us and certainly are doing a lot of work in terms of what you do under your umbrella, but who's involved in ensuring that these responses to the calls to action actually come to life? And then a follow-up to that, sort of how are they involved? And we know sport organizations have these sort of siloed departments, but it seems like that work needs to be pulled together. So who's involved and how are they involved in this response?
So I'd say I'll maybe start from the pro sports angle of it all. I think this is one, truth and reconciliation, but this also falls across kind of the cross section of social impact. Like it's a bit of the two-sided angle of it, where a lot of the leagues themselves, so the OHL, the CHL, or sorry, CFL, CHL as well, and the parent league for the hockey side, they have committees that they create. I sit on the OHL committee for things related to truth and reconciliation, DEI related things, Black History Month, like those kind of things all fall within responsibility in the leagues themselves. The CFL is a bit more of a cohesive strategy, whereas the OHL has a specific staff that deals with education and social initiatives. So the league itself on the CFL side has created a bit of the mandate around truth and reconciliation. So you'll see it coming the next month. And in terms of September and leading up to truth and reconciliation, pretty well every team has some element to its game day related to either orange jerseys, logos themselves that are designed related to Indigenous artists or have been designed by Indigenous artists and related to that community. We all have local acts or performances that happen during our games as well. So that's a bit of a mandate from the league side that related to truth and reconciliation. They worked with Mary Simon, who's obviously our Governor General and an Indigenous woman herself, a few years back in terms of setting that overall structure and mandate. We as a team have always been involved or done something, especially being in Ottawa. Ottawa, one, is a very socially aware city, but also connected to the government. So it has a bit more of a tie there. And some of our other teams in the CFL side, specifically Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, Edmonton, they all have very close connections to the Indigenous community there. Saskatchewan and Winnipeg, obviously, being very close to fairly large Indigenous reserves themselves. So there's a bit more of a direct connection for those teams, and they feel that. BC too. BC is a great example of that, as somebody who's done initiatives related to truth and reconciliation for a number of years. And then I would say on the OHL side, the hockey side, it's a bit more piecemealed in terms of the teams. So what team wants to do what. You also see in the OHL that the resources are a bit more stretched thin. We are fortunate to have a large organization that supports our OHL team, so we have a bit more capacity with a charitable foundation and everything. But you don't see that with all teams. I'll maybe use the Niagara Ice Dogs, for example, being a local Niagara team, is that they maybe don't have the large parent company that helps support them. So they're a bit more resource strained in what they do in St. Catharines and in the local community side. And the league has to step in a bit more and mandate those things with them, whereas other teams maybe have their own strategy at the first place. So then coming down to the organizational level, so I'll come down to OSEG level. For us, I was just the co-chair of our EDI and B committee. So we just finished our 2025 to 2027 strategy around EDI and B, so equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging as an organization. And so some of these truth and reconciliation initiatives fall within that mandate. So each of our departments gets a select set of, let's say, objectives is probably the right word for it, that they are to complete by 2027. Based on this plan was created through internal consultation. We had an original plan that started in 2020, which just recently expired in 2023. That was a larger plan that was created around EDI, and that was more focused on, we had a bit more of an honest conversation with our staff and players following the murder of George Floyd. Obviously, our players on the Red Black side, especially the football side, come from America and are obviously Black Americans, many of them. So they have a bit more of a personal experience with that. So EDI was brought in as a kind of a core tenet of what we are as an organization. Ever since then, it's now actually in our strategic planning as well. In terms of our long-term documents, it's written in there now. So there's a lot more of a internal effort towards EDI and B in terms of everything we do. Obviously, that tails into what we do with truth and reconciliation, being committed both from the support of the CFL side and the OHL has it as one of their priorities as well. And then we have it with each of our teams. So in terms of OSEG, who's involved with it, like you said, I would say it's kind of a joint effort. Our hope when it comes to EDI&B is that every department is doing something or trying to be involved in some way. We don't have maybe the single staff that leads that initiative. And you've probably seen over the last year or so, a lot of those staff or those organizations have let go of those staff, unfortunately. And just because it's been so siloed to one person that they don't see when it's not ingrained in each of their departments and their strategy and their overall vision, you don't see the long-term effects and the long-term planning that goes into it that you need for this work. And so that's what a bit of a difference that we have within our organization. So community, myself, I have a number of initiatives. One of them is, like I said before, the Indigenous youth camp that we ran. That would fall into one of my objectives of running X amount of events that are related to EDI&B in some way. Some of it's sports exchange. So an example of an event that I actually am considering doing is bringing in some lacrosse players from the Indigenous Reserve just to teach our players on what that looks like to them and what sport means to them. And so that's a sport exchange. That's an example of another objective that would fall into that report as well. It's an internal report, but we use it as a bit of a guiding principle for us when it comes to this work. And so then from there, our marketing department would have some, our foundation would have some as well. And then our partnerships team, et cetera, would have some objectives. And then from there, it goes down to our fans. So I think the thing that I always like to mention is that as an organization, we are a fan-first organization. That's fans or spectators is kind of what you live for. That's what you're building towards. And so ensuring that a lot of those objectives are also meeting our needs of our fans and having those discussions with fans and getting feedback from part-time staff who engage directly with those fans. And so in terms of truth and reconciliation work, something we heard from fans when we first started doing all this work, especially around game days, is that they love to see the inclusion of local artists and local communities in that space. We do have a lot of Indigenous fans as well that come to our games, especially having a player from Manitoulin Island. A lot of his family will come out to our games as well for 67. So adding those elements helps support those fans and their experience at games. So that's kind of I would say, top-down approach. The public, and when I say fans, I'd say the public's probably a piece of that. The city of Ottawa, just those general public as well, probably see a piece of it, but it's a very much an all-encompassing strategy. And I would never say there's a limitation on who should be involved. If somebody wants to learn or understand, they should be involved. When it comes to a key overarching strategy, you do need to have buy-in at each level of your department and even the leagues themselves, or it doesn't really get you anywhere. And that's where I think a lot of the gap has been in EDI work in the last few years. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, lots of stuff to cover there, Marc. Just as a clarification for our audience, I think at one point you said EDI and B, and I just want to clarify equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging.
Yes, belonging is the fourth word. We actually just added belonging in the new plan. The reason for the inclusion of belonging, our internal, I guess it's also been an external strategy as well. But when we do recruitment, we've used Experience, Grow, Belong is kind of been our title when we're doing recruitment to external staff and to bring in new staff. And so Belong has always been a part of who we are as a recruitment. We've noticed in the last few years, especially as we've evolved in our EDI work, that belong has come out, like the sense of belonging, like knowing that this is a place for you and you're comfortable in who you are, has come out as a kind of a key tenet in terms of what people look for when they, one, come to work, but also come here as a fan. And so that's why belonging was added to the report this year as a kind of a key definition that we use throughout the report as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a key piece to really even separating out the letters as well and recognizing they each mean something different, right? The other thing I wanted to kind of highlight in what you were saying is the idea of building this work into the fabric of the organization. So when you talk about the strategic plan, and I know our students and maybe other listeners, like we understand the work of a strategic plan in most of our organizations, but when you build the calls to action and truth and reconciliation into a strategic plan, this creates longevity, and it comes back to your point, which I'd never thought of, like, not that you don't need that specific role, but that it's then now a core of who you are as an organization. And the fact that that's happening, I think, is really important. And you alluded to it, but maybe it's not necessarily the fabric of every piece of, so you have the OHL, you have the CFL, and you can see it maybe a little bit stronger as the fabric in, I think, the CFL is what I'm hearing from you. And in that, one of the things that really came to me was you talk about how the teams within that league work together quite well, or there's a bit more of cohesion. And I think of the calls to action, and I think of Indigenous ways of knowing and engaging, and this idea of community is really fostered in that space. And so it almost makes sense that if the CFL already organically has that collaborative space, that it's actually coming through in how you're answering the calls. Is that an accurate thing?
Yeah, I think it's fair. And I think that's like the long-term planning piece, and it goes back to what we talked about like EDI and just seeing the evolution of the work over the last number of years, is that if the teams aren't bought in at every level of the organization, and it's only the CEO who's preaching from the mountaintops, but you don't have the coordinator who's bringing the ideas to the table, or you just have the coordinator who's really interested in this, but senior leadership doesn't want to invest in it. Like there's going to be a gap at some level. And so the fact that the leagues are interested, especially the CFL, like you mentioned, they have come out openly and it's like asked that each of the teams be involved in truth and reconciliation, asked that each of them develop logos, asked that each of them work with their local communities. And so coming from that's coming from their management council, which is the presidents across the league, right? And so having the management council being bought in, every level of the organization being bought in, and having that ingrained. And even though it's written as diversity, equity, inclusion, or written in other ways, it still encompasses what truth and reconciliation is looking for. It's looking for acceptance. Like it's looking for the ability for the Indigenous people to feel like they belong in our space, and are welcomed in who they are in our space. And I think that's what's really important about the work that teams are doing, especially in Canada. The US, there's some great examples in the US too, even about work that's done in EDI space, especially around some of the like Spanish communities and those coming from Mexico as well, and like that what they're doing in the soccer world to create inclusion. And I think that's what we're seeing in Canada right now, is at least there's an organizational buy-in to it, which is as important, I think, as anything in terms of that space.
Yeah. And you use the word mandate a lot in your description. And I think that's important to highlight too, because one of the things I've learned, because I'm doing a lot of learning through all this, is this notion of the calls to action aren't recommended. This is something that we all are doing or should be doing and must be doing as Canadians, answering the calls, and anyone that's living on this land. And so I'm always noting like sort of what's being repeated, and this idea of mandate, I think, is important for us to really take in as listeners. If this is being posted to students in our classrooms, that this isn't something that you can kind of consider as a maybe, it's a must.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's also important to keep in mind too that as much as these are like maybes or there's recommendations, and I think that's what it's written on, even on the federal website and everything. These people are people that are coming out to support your activities and your games. And if you're not, this is something that all of their communities have agreed on for you to action. If you're not at least taking it seriously, then there's something you're missing, because this is a fan base that you're missing too. And I think that's the thing that we always talk about when it comes to inclusion work, especially around sports, is like, at the end of the day, these are also your fans. It doesn't matter whether it's a small portion of your fan base or a large portion of your fan base. You always want to make sure that your fans are feeling included. And so you need to be taking anything that's coming from those communities seriously. And especially in Canada, that's what we've been asked to do. And I think we all need to do that as part of our day-to-day and our work that we do within OSEG. At least from the way we talk about it, that's how we talk about it, is that this is still a core tenet of who we are.
So as a follow-up, Marc, I'm just thinking about the fans, and the fans are certainly a big part of sport and sport organizations and how they manage. So as a fan, if I'm sitting in the crowd, how do I support the work that you're doing at OSEG and what I see at the events that I'm attending?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think one is provide feedback. So provide like that. I think that's a big part of what we do day to day. Every single event we host here, we get NPS survey results from. We all take it very, very seriously. We get reports after every event we host. And so you'll get an email basically from our database that says, please rank this event, provide any commentary you want. If you do see something like an Indigenous activity at an event, provide positive commentary, because that does get seen by everybody. That gets seen at every level of organization. Our executive look at that kind of stuff. Because when it comes, like I said before, when it comes to understanding fans, it's very important for us to take feedback. That's kind of the crux of a lot of it. I think the other piece of it too is that when you see the foundation, for example, so a lot of our sports organizations have a charitable arm or a foundation. Most of them are involved in this type of sport development work. Finding ways to support them, whether volunteering, whether providing monetary donations, like that's the thing that they're looking for to help continue this type of programming. So I know our foundation, even I'll kind of give a plug to 50-50. Any sports event you go to, the 50-50 is likely going to a charity that's attached to the sports organization, especially in Canada. Canada. If you go to a CFL game, most of that's going back to these kind of initiatives. So I think that's something to keep in mind when you're at a sporting event as a fan, is that the foundations or the community-based organizations that are trying to engage you at the game are often trying to do a lot of that work. And so keep an eye out when you're at the sports events and understanding of who's in your space. Oftentimes too, if we're hosting a Truth and Reconciliation game, we'll actually have multiple booths on site. So we've had a local artisan fair before of local Indigenous artists. And so keep an eye out for that when it comes around September, because most teams will do something related to having local Indigenous artists. And that's a way to support those people as well on site. They're usually selling scrunchies or t-shirts or something that they've been able to create in their own space. So that's a couple options. I'd say provide positive feedback to the things you like to see. Look for those organizations that are on site supporting this kind of work, and also understand that most sports organizations have the ability to do this work. They just need to put the effort in and the understanding of a larger scale mandate. And so encourage them to do that as a fan.
Nice. Amazing. Yeah. I know when I was out in Saskatchewan last year during the season and we went to a Rough Riders game, and one of the ways we chose to sort of highlight this point is buying a sweatshirt. So I wanted to buy merch, and there was merchandise that had Indigenous artists who created a special logo, and just purchasing that sweater instead of a different one, really contributing in small ways, but identifying that that's a good way to attempt to make a connection.
Yeah. And we're all it's a great point. We're all very cognizant of that stuff too. So like if we ever created we created a hat, I think 2 years ago, and hats aren't super cheap. Like if you're buying a new hair hat, just at cost, it's quite expensive. But everything we had from proceeds side went to Indigenous charity. We know that it's not the right thing for us to do to keep that kind of profit or that side of things. So we will provide donations to Indigenous groups based on the work we do in that space. So
yeah. No. And sort of the flip side to this in terms of support, just knowing that just the way we are in North American society right now moves towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some folks' feelings in terms of what's happening with Truth and Reconciliation aren't always positive. And so if you get negative reactions from fans in terms of the work that you're doing in this area, how do you navigate that as a sport organization?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question. So this kind of work, I think the biggest thing that we kind of talk about internally, and I work closely with my senior vice president is Janice Baresi. She's senior vice president, social impact and marketing and brands. So she kind of oversees a lot of how we communicate back out to fans and how we communicate to fans generally. And social impact falls into that bubble. And a lot of the conversation we always have is, if we get negative feedback, negative commentary, how are we educating that fan about why we're doing this work? Like what are we doing to create, one, keep a safe environment, ensure that we're still being as positive as possible, but two, educating them on why we're doing this type of thing. So we just had, I know June was Pride Month, and so we had a number of negative comments come in through anything we put out on social, etc. And if there's anything directly to our organization, we would respond with, here's the example of why we're doing this work. Here's a bit of education on why it makes sense, one, for us to engage with it, but also why it's important to our community to engage with it. And so that's a big part of how we approach it. And we also try to do that in our day-to-day with our staff too. So anytime we just went through kind of it's Pride's an interesting one, because we have June Pride, which is Pride Month pretty well across North America. But then August is also Capital Pride Week. So we just had Capital Pride Week here in Ottawa. And so we did a staff education session in July just to split the middle of both of them. And it was provided from You Can Play, which is a local diversity inclusion organization that works a lot in the Pride space. And it's how we educate our staff so that if they get asked that at the site, or if they want to know from their own personal stance how to react and how to comment on this kind of stuff, they can. So it was a lot about that and how to work with fans in terms of educating them on that space. So yeah, I think education is the biggest thing. I find a lot of the negative commentary comes from ignorance or just a lack of understanding, more than it does that they actually have a sense of hatred around it. And I also want to say too, in that space, we have a lot of fans that love the work we do with that side, like especially around Truth and Reconciliation, we get so many positive comments about where they're happy to see the logo, they're happy to see us selling merch that's provided as a charitable donation back to Indigenous communities. Like I think that's the biggest thing we take away from it, is that as much as there's a negative, there's also a lot of positive. And so those that we're educating, we can also help shine the light on those that are being positive too. So that's probably the two sides that I would say if you're trying to navigate that space.
Yeah, and helpful for sport organizations, but also here on campus. Part of what we're doing with this podcast is we are doing a lot of work through September around truth and reconciliation. And we've acknowledged as a working group that there will be some individuals or groups who aren't necessarily on the same side as we are in terms of these conversations. And not that there's sides, but more so just will come at us with negative comments. And so the education piece, I love that you brought that up in terms of education, learning, being open to things. The calls to action in a lot of areas, whether it's the health calls, education calls, or the sport calls. I know there's media calls within the calls to action is really a lot about learning and embracing new knowledge and new understanding around Indigenous peoples, which I think is so important. So with that last question, formal question, I know I have all these follow-ups, but what items are you excited to see moving forward with OSEG's commitment to truth and reconciliation? It's more about you personally. Like, what are you personally excited about?
I think I'm excited. I think we've done a lot of really great work around educating our staff and our fans about what we can do and what we should be focusing on. I'm excited about the potential for future collaborations. We were just discussing updating our land acknowledgement at the site in the next couple of months. And we're talking to the Algonquin Nation. And I think thinking back to when I first started, I was able to just call the guy up right away and just be like, hey, I think we should do this. What do you think about this? And he's bringing it to their council meeting moving forward. And I'm like, I didn't have that connection when I first started. We didn't really have that direct conversation. And I think now that we have those initial connections in the spaces, there's so much more opportunity beyond just the original collaboration. The original collaboration is like, let's just get a foot in the door. Let's figure out a way to make something happen. But now that it's a bit more of a open landscape in terms of you have those connections in space. Now, what are you going to do with it? And I think for us, it's finding ways to continue to educate, but also showcase the amazing athletes that come from that side. So we have one of our staff actually who just went to the World Championships for box lacrosse. She's from the Indigenous community. She was one of the coaches for that team, and now we're showcasing her story online. We're talking about her in our huddle. Our huddles are like internal communication platform. I get to have her come speak at events when I go to schools, and so I think like the openness to that space is now created so much more opportunity around it, and I think I'm excited to see what we haven't done yet, if that makes sense. Like finding the things that we haven't done and continuing to evolve in that space, because there's so much that I continue to learn. I think even this past year, when we went down to Akwesasne again, like about a month ago, and just having those like more authentic conversations with the people that live there, who kind of obviously live that space their day to day. I still learn so much about their own history and their own ancestry, and just about the athletes that have played there over the years. They have a whole wall in Akwesasne. If you've ever been, it's a great spot to check out. It's called the Turtle Dome, and it's an older lacrosse arena, and they have a whole wall that's dedicated to athletes that played there before. And most of them are often now professional athletes or have come up through the community, but they're pointing out to them and saying, oh, that was my grandfather, or that was my dad, or my cousin, and just seeing the pride on their faces, talking about that. It's probably what I'm looking forward to seeing continue. So
amazing. One of the things I think I'm going to end it on is just coming back to what we think about sport. And sport is competition. And you say fans want to see that. We said this at the beginning when we were chatting. Fans want to see the wins on the field of play. But what you and your organization are doing, and what others are doing, and what Indigenous communities are built for, is collaboration. So yes, we can compete, but the connection, collaboration, true, authentic connections is what we're hearing here, and really emphasizing that cuts across many calls to action, and just is sort of, I think, the fabric of truth and reconciliation. When we're learning, we're listening, and we're building relationships. And really, really, thank you so much, Marc, for being involved in this podcast and chatting with us. I learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners are learning with us.
No problem at all. And I think, I guess maybe if I can make one last comment, I'd say if you're a student or a staff listening to this, like don't ever be afraid to go talk to somebody from the Indigenous community if you want to learn more. they find like such joy in sharing their own stories with you, and they want to showcase who they are as well. And I think we've always been afraid to directly engage with them at times. And for right or wrong, it's just how it's been. And I think just being able to encourage your students to go speak with as many members of the community as possible is so important. It gives you so much more perspective. It also allows you to create opportunities for them as well. So
yeah, authentic connections, absolutely. Thanks, Marc.
Thank you for listening to this special 4-part series on truth and reconciliation, a collaboration between the podcast Eve Intersected and the Podcast Learning Network at Brock University's Faculty of Humanities.
I'm your co-host, Kay.
And I'm your co-host, Shannon.
I'm producer, Allison.
And I'm audio producer, Andrew Camacho. Please check the show notes for links mentioned in each episode, and don't forget to visit our YouTube page where you can find each episode with subtitles at youtube.com/eveintersected. Our theme music is Unstoppable Dance Show by Nexus Sound Studio and Your Black Hoodie by White Records. These tracks are used under Creative Commons Zero license from pixabay.com.